Hey there, I'm Drew Hoffman from UC Davis Sociology. Today I'm going to be talking about barriers and political strategies for expanding or shrinking the welfare state. Most of this discussion will be about expanding the welfare state, but many of these lessons could also apply to efforts to shrink the welfare state. And in some places I refer to that explicitly. Okay, so first we'll talk about the barriers. So some of the people who might end up opposing various government programs, welfare state programs, would be rich people who would have to pay more taxes most likely and would benefit often less from these programs, especially to the extent that programs are redistributive. Taxpayers may object. The business community, which also doesn't love taxes often, could have a problem. You might have a problem from particular industries or corporations. For example, any effort to reduce the home mortgage interest deduction would face opposition from the real estate industry, or an attempt to mandate that employers provide health insurance, for example, would face opposition. People who are opposed to immigration are often concerned to make sure that programs don't include immigrants or especially undocumented immigrants. People who are, excuse me, people who are market fundamentalists could have issues if the program interferes with the market in some way. Political parties, Republicans might oppose expansion, Democrats might support them. Social movements, labor unions, religious organizations who might oppose programs that they feel undermine the family or undermine religion. If you're trying to cut back the welfare state, certainly you might face opposition from current beneficiaries as well as from the labor unions and from the Democratic Party. You might also, if you're cutting, you also could face opposition from industries that benefit from the current system. So I'm thinking in particular of the healthcare industry. If there are major cuts in healthcare funding, Medicare funding, for example, often you'll find various healthcare providers opposed to that. You also might face some opposition from many different kinds of racists and sexists, people who are overtly racist, who are covertly racist, who try not to be racist, but still are because, pretty much everyone is because of the way in which they live in this American culture. Some people might think that although there was racial inequality in the past, the U.S. has moved beyond that and might support sort of colorblind type policies. You also have people who, may support racial and ethnic or gender equality, but are yet reluctant to give up all of the benefits that white privilege or male privilege can provide. There's also a number of elements in American culture that might pose difficulties. So a basic notion in American culture that the economy should be left to its own, a laissez-faire capitalism idea. Also an idea that individuals should tend to themselves rather than having the government provide for them, a lot of suspicion of the idea of dependency on government. Also a lot of skepticism about government power and the power of concentrated authorities, as well as a critique of government suggesting that government is inherently inefficient. Racial stereotypes can come into play as well when programs are viewed as benefiting particular groups who white people view as undeserving. You also can have existing frames and discourses about a particular policy that can be constraining. For example, it's long been the case that healthcare is provided through employers rather than through the government, for the most part, although Medicare and Medicaid are exceptions. And so that can sort of affect the way that the public and policymakers think about that policy. In terms of people who are trying to cut back the welfare state or promote moral goals through the welfare state, some aspects of American culture that they might find objectionable and a problem are the increasing secularism in the United States, and also what they would call moral relativism, an idea that there are no moral absolutes and that anything goes, a notion of tolerance, etc. These could be barriers to imposing policies that have particular moral points of view. There are also various institutional barriers. So one is existing policies. Just to give an example, it's related to the example I just gave. Passing single-payer health insurance or even Obamacare faced this problem that most people already had health insurance. And those people were afraid that if the system changed, it might work against them. They might be worse off. And also less of a sort of constituency for expanding expanding health care benefits to people who don't currently get them. Federalism is another barrier in that sometimes you'll have state-level opponents of various proposals. Also, proposals are often structured so that they're administered by both the state and federal levels, and so then you'll get really strong barriers in the states to generous provision. Some states will be more generous, some states will be less generous. In recent years, that's been mainly about whether the state is run by Republicans or Democrats. The separation of powers is a key factor in that programs need to get through both houses of Congress and the presidency, but often these institutions are held by different parties, and so this makes it very difficult to get legislation enacted. Moreover, even after a policy is enacted, there's often a court case. People sue. It ends up going to the federal courts and oftentimes to the Supreme Court. So that sort of judicial review possibility in the American system adds an additional barrier to enacting various policies. So now let's talk about some of the strategies that one might use to address some of this. So first, one thing I'll mention is as you come up with policy proposals, you might think of yourself as wearing two different hats. So one is a policy hat in which you're really trying to design a policy that would be the most efficient for addressing the problem that you're trying to deal with. A second idea would be about your political hat. And so this is the part where you're trying to think about strategies for getting that policy passed. But more than that, policy design itself can be a political strategy. And so Jacob Hacker calls this putting politics first. It's an idea that you design the policy not only to be efficient, but also to deal with the various opponents that it might face. As a result, the program might not be quite as efficient as it might otherwise be, but it can actually pass. And so, just as an example, I think Obama and many people on the left believe that single-payer health care would be cheaper and more efficient for providing health care to Americans. But Obama and others, made a decision that was politically untenable, and so they opted for a system that mainly preserved the private system of healthcare benefits. So this would be a notion. There's also some things that Obama did in terms of trying to make sure that people, as many people as possible, could keep their existing policy in order to remove that fear that people might have of being made worse off by the policy. Okay, so one strategy one might use is universalism. So this is the idea that you provide the benefit to everyone. This can increase political support because you're not having particular groups of people receiving it. Near universalism would be programs that benefit most of the population but maybe exclude some people. I'm thinking in particular of Social Security, which requires that people have worked a certain number of years. It's near universal but not completely. A second idea has to do with targeting and selection. People who are the most in need would receive the benefit, and so this could increase political support. This is especially the case when you target particular groups that are popular, such as children, for example. There's also targeting within universalism. I see I've misspelled that. In targeting within universalism, the policy is universal, but because such programs are so expensive, they often won't be enough to address the very strong, the needs of the most disadvantaged. And so the notion here is that there's a universal policy, but in addition to that policy, there's targeting to particular groups that have more need. Another possibility would be destigmatization. So this is an effort to make sure that programs are delivered in a way that doesn't stigmatize their beneficiaries. It doesn't require them to jump through a bunch of hoops, doesn't restrict their ability to buy certain goods, etc. Doesn't make them go through demeaning rituals to achieve their aid. And then it could involve education as well about sort of the needs of these people to receive these. It's basically an attempt to make sure that beneficiaries do not become stigmatized. And universalism is part of such a strategy as well. It's a notion that if you target a particular program, it often can builds resentment because of hostility that people have to the poor and a belief that poor people aren't trying hard enough or something like that. Also a problem where people who are near eligible but not eligible may resent the fact that they also have quite strong needs but are not eligible for the policy. If you're trying to expand a program but you want to gain the support of various opponents of welfare benefits, one possibility is quite the opposite of destigmatization, would be to impose restrictions of various sorts on the beneficiaries. For example, SNAP, the nutrition program, might restrict what types of things people can buy with their grant. So this is, or programs might have work requirements to receive them. This is an attempt to satisfy people who believe that poor people are not working hard enough or that poor people aren't capable of spending their money wisely, etc. So it's an attempt to reach out to opponents. Another strategy has to do with policy feedbacks, and this is to design your policy in such a way that support for the policy builds over time. One of the classic examples of this is Social Security. Because people pay into Social Security over the courses of their lives, it would be very difficult to cut Social Security benefits because people feel that they have earned those benefits and that thus it would be unfair to take them away. Another thing that can be done to sort of diffuse opposition is to gradually phase things in so that people have more time to get used to it. For example, if you were planning to create Medicare for all, you might start by having people who are 60 and over be eligible for the first 5 years. And then 5 years later, people who are 55 and over become eligible. So it's a way of phasing things in to give people time to adjust to it, but also to show that the sky is not going to fall, this is not going to be a disaster, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. A few other strategies. So one is if you face opponents, particularly in industry, you could buy them off. So this is what happened with Obamacare. The pharmaceutical industry was worried that it was going to take a pretty big hit to its prices, and so the Obama administration negotiated with the pharmaceutical industry to make sure that that hit was, only medium rather than large, or some might say small. And as a result, pharma ended up supporting the legislation rather than opposing it. Another opportunity would be to discredit your opponents. The Obama administration had the insurers on board for a while, but then the insurers turned against the proposal, and then the administration vilified the insurers, claimed that they were trying to thwart the will of the American people or make profits off the American people, etc. So this is a matter of basically directly attacking your opponents to appeal to other constituencies in the polity. Another possibility is to have two different tiers of a service or a benefit. This can reduce the costs of such benefits. It can also address sometimes rich people don't like universal pensions because the pensions aren't generous enough. So it'd be possible to have one level of universal pensions, but an additional level that's contributory and then would allow inequality so that rich people could contribute more and have higher pensions. So this is one way to diffuse opposition as well. Another source is to let people voluntarily decide whether they want to participate in a program rather than to mandate it or force it. You can also provide various incentives for compliance or participation. Employers, for example, will often match their employees' contributions to a pension plan to try and help their employees, incentivize their employees to participate. Also, the more choice or flexibility you give to people in choosing, for example, what health care provider they might have or which child care provider they might have, and also their opportunities to change those choices over time, this can reduce people's opposition to various programs. Nudges are even less, not only is it voluntary, but the government intervention is quite small, maybe even imperceptible. And so one example of this is it's been found that if employees are automatically enrolled in a savings program for retirement, they tend to just stay in the program. On the other hand, if they are not enrolled as a default and they have to themselves enroll, they're less likely to do so. The classic example of the nudge is urinals that have a little fly at the bottom of them. And the notion is that when you put that fly in there, people are going to be more likely to aim better at the urinal. This is a classic example of the nudge, not a welfare state nudge, though. Another strategy is to focus on how efficient your policy will be. There's a broad critique of government as an inefficient provider of benefits, and you could focus on why your program will be more efficient. A last set of strategies. One is to set up things in a way that would enhance the political power of your recipients. There's been some research showing that when people receive benefits, they're more likely to participate in the political system. You could also include proposals that are not really part of a welfare state per se, but that do increase the political power of recipients. The obvious example is to change it so that it's easier to vote, since poorer people are less likely to vote, and there's a lot of voter suppression currently occurring in many states. Another possibility is to educate people about contemporary and historical inequalities in order to provide a justification for their policies and to help people understand what they're all about. There's also possibilities of advertising for your program. You might also call this propaganda. Naming and framing is an important factor here too. So, for example, Republicans have relabeled the estate tax, a tax on money that people inherit from their parents. They've renamed it as a death tax, suggesting, I can't even afford to die anymore and the government's going to tax me. But it's really an inheritance tax, and so this is a way to change the way people talk about it. Pro-choice and pro-life are other good examples of this. The idea is if you're for abortion, you're not for life. If you're against abortion, you don't believe in choice. So it's an attempt to sort of discredit one's opponents and make yourself look good. Lying is always a possibility, or just sort of shading the truth. Obama said that if you liked your current health program, you could keep it. That was true for most, but not for all. And so it wouldn't be 100% true. Republicans and Donald Trump have claimed that recent tax cuts do not benefit the wealthy, when this is clearly not the case. I'd say number one was shading the truth, because it was mainly true. Number two is a straight out lie. In this same category is the idea of whether your welfare state will be visible or invisible. When taxes are more visible, income taxes may be more visible than sales taxes, although there's some dispute on this. It might be easier to pass a plan. As you know, a lot of programs in the American welfare state are done through employer provision with various tax subsidies. And so a lot of Americans don't really realize that they're receiving welfare benefits as a result. And so this is called the hidden welfare state. And doing things this way can end up undermining support for the welfare state because the beneficiaries don't really realize what they're receiving, and they resent the taxes at the same time. Another possibility is obfuscation. This is hiding the meaning of the policies, making them more difficult to understand, making sure that their outcomes take place in the future at a time when that people have a difficult time imagining or understanding what the implications will be. Another possibility is to emphasize benefits outside of your program. So if you are doing a drug treatment program, you might talk about the ways in which that might reduce crime. I mean, the main goal of the program is to provide services to people with drug addiction, but you could argue that there are these additional benefits. Another possibility, single payer, for example, Most proponents, and this has been the experience throughout the world, find that single payer provides healthcare at a much lower percentage of GDP, a much lower cost. And so this could be an argument for single payer that goes beyond just providing health insurance for everyone. Okay, so that's it. And if you want to comment, Drew Hoffman on Twitter. And thank you very much.